My name is John Mark Johnson Jr., and I am the host of Reformed GGA. And I'm here to give you 6 reasons as to why you should add 9mm caliber guns to your gun collection. Now, I want to state this up front, and I want it to be very clear that I'm not telling you that you need to get rid of all of your other guns and replace them with 9mm guns. I'm saying it's a good idea to add a 9mm gun or two to your collection. I'm not saying that you have to get rid of everything that you have, or that everything that you have is stupid, or you shouldn't have it, etc., etc. That's not what I'm saying. So all of you 45 caliber guys, you can keep your 45s. All of you 40 caliber guys, I'm not saying to get rid of your 40 caliber guns. And on down the list goes. I'm just saying that there are some good reasons for why adding a 9mm gun or two to your existing collection can be a beneficial and useful thing. So do we have that clear? I'm not telling you to get rid of your other guns. I'm not telling you to replace all of your other guns with 9mm. I'm saying think about adding it to your current collection. We got that? We're good? Alright, so that being said, the first reason why it's a good idea to add a 9mm gun, or guns as the case may be, to your current collection is that 9mm is a relatively inexpensive centerfire round most of the time. Now granted, the situation that we're living under right now, during the current pandemic, or at least panicdemic, is going to mess with prices a little bit. But normally, 9mm is a very inexpensive round, and usually the most inexpensive out of all the centerfire cartridges. And for plinking purposes, it makes sense to have guns that are relatively inexpensive and easy to shoot. One of the things that I see very frequently with my friends who have other kinds of calibers, whether it be 45 or 40 or 44 Magnum or 357 or 38 Special, or throw in pretty much any centerfire cartridge that you want in there, they will, when they go to the range and they practice, they will usually not shoot as many rounds as I do. They don't simply practice as much as I do. And with some of them, not all, but with some of them, the fact that they don't practice very much really shows, and you can tell. And the reason why they don't practice as much usually comes down to cost. If you have something that costs, 30 cents a round to send down range, whereas 9mm is, maybe 20 cents a round or less, that makes a pretty big difference in how many of those things you can put down range. Good chunk more. You can get a lot more bang for your buck, as it were. So the first reason to have a 9mm gun is that if you're going to shoot a lot and practice a lot, it makes sense to have something that's not going to absolutely break the bank. Reason number 2, in addition to the rounds being fairly cheap, not as cheap as say 22 LR or something like that, but in addition to being fairly cheap, one of the things that is most amazing about 9mm is that it is very market stable. And when I'm talking about the market, I'm talking about specifically the US citizen market in the contiguous United States. So just letting you know that that's specifically what I'm referencing, but I'll say the American market for short. But really I'm talking about the civilian market in the contiguous United States, but we'll just call it the American market for short. Sorry, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, other territories, you've been temporarily demoted. And it's mostly just because getting ammunition out to you is sometimes a little bit of a different situation, especially Hawaii. Hawaii is weird. But be that as it may, in the contiguous United States, 9mm tends to be very market stable, and the reason for that is that 9mm makes up about 20%, it's actually over 20% of the American market. Meaning that ammunition manufacturers have the most motivation to produce 9mm. It is the biggest chunk of their income, far and away. It's more than double any other cartridge. Any other caliber, it's more than double any of the others. And the data that I'm using for that, by the way, comes from Lucky Gunner. Lucky Gunner is a place online that sells ammunition, and they will often do reports on how their sales went. And they're a big enough distributor that their results are usually fairly indicative of what's going on in the market as a whole. I don't really have a way to judge where 9mm exactly would sit in the worldwide market, because I'm not aware of any distributor that is completely worldwide. But that being said, a 9mm is a standard NATO round, and so most NATO nations are going to have 9mm. It might be in a government stockpile, but they're going to have 9mm. And even a lot of non-NATO nations are also going to have 9mm. It is a fairly ubiquitous cartridge, fairly ubiquitous caliber, more accurately, for what we're talking about here. It's all over the place, and like I said, it makes up easily the biggest chunk of the market. And because of that, the motivation for getting 9mm out among manufacturers is much higher than with any other cartridge. And that even includes the rimfire cartridges, 22LR and that. In fact, most manufacturers actually don't make a whole lot from 22LR. Like I said, 9mm is more than 20% of the US market, whereas 22LR is only about 7%. It's actually a little bit less than 7% of the total US markets. And it's also not a top 50% cartridge, the 22LR is, whereas 9mm is. By top 50%, I mean the cartridges that will give you the top 50% of manufacturers' income. That would be the 9mm is number 1, then 223, then 45 and 40. So your 45 and 40 guys, you're on the list. It's good. Those 4 rounds account for about half of all of the income that ammunition manufacturers make in the American market. Like I said, I'm speaking specifically of the contiguous United States, because that's where Lucky Gunner's data primarily comes from. I think they may also ship to Alaska, I'm not sure, but mostly the contiguous United States. So in the American market, huge chunk goes to just those 4 calibers, and of those 4, 9mm far and away outstrips the other ones. 22LR, on the other hand, it's in the bottom 50% category, and it only makes up about less than 7% of the total ammunition market. So the motivation for replenishing 22 is not very high. And that's why in the past we have seen 22 fly off the shelf for one reason or another. There's some kind of a panic or some kind of a shortage because the manufacturers took some government contracts, and so all their 22 went to government contracts, and so there was no 22 that was available on the civilian market, and it wasn't replaced for a very long time. And the reason why it wasn't replaced for a very long time is because ammunition manufacturers don't get a lot out of 22. But they do get a ton out of 9mm. Like I said, it is the biggest chunk of the ammunition market. So if you want something that's going to be fairly stable, that's going to get replaced very quickly in the event of some kind of a crisis, as long as there's manufacturing that's going to happen for civilians, the first thing on the list is always going to be 9mm. 22LR is nice and cheap and all that, but it's not very market stable, and we've seen that in the past. 9mm, on the other hand, it's not nearly as cheap as 22LR, but it is much more market stable. And I'm talking about the civilian market. Much more market stable. Okay. Night and day. 9mm is a top 50% round. 22LR is a bottom 50% round. 9mm makes up over 20% of American ammunition manufacturers' income, at least on the civilian market. 22LR, less than 7%. Night and day difference between the two. And what's interesting is even with the current situation, which has led to ammunition shortages in a few places, price hikes, all kinds of weird things going on in the firearms market, I'm actually still able to get a hold of a lot of 9mm ammunition. Now, some of my ammunition, like the Speer Lawman 124 grain 9mm, I had before all of this craziness took place, and I had quite a bit of it. But most of the ammunition that I have right now, I've actually bought during the current situation for a price that was pretty close to what I was paying before. I have some Winchester NATO. I actually have quite a bit of this stuff. I have some Winchester 115 grain, and I have quite a bit of this stuff as well. I also have some Browning 124 grain flanking ammo. It is really easy to keep a 9mm gun fed, even in a fairly bad situation like what we have here. Now, I have seen prices start to climb a little bit, but I was able to order even after it became really evident that things were going to go bad in the firearm market. I was still able to order literally thousands upon thousands of rounds at pretty close to the same prices that I normally pay. No substantial difference to me. And because of that, I'm sitting on literally thousands of rounds of ammo to my name, and I actually have even more coming in tomorrow. I just have a lot of 9mm ammunition because it's very market stable. There's a ton of it in the market to start with, and manufacturers are usually very motivated to get it back out on the market if there's ever a shortage. And that is a really nice thing. Okay, there's some other ways that people deal with ammo supply problems. Just stock a bunch up in the first place, and I had a pretty good stock to begin with, but war never hurts. That's what some people do, just stockpile throughout the years, and then when there's some kind of a shortage, you're sitting good, and that's not a bad way to go. Other people will specialize in kind of oddball calibers. They'll have like a 41 Magnum or something like that, which is not a bad way to go because they're not very common, and so if there's some kind of a run on ammunition, it's not overly likely that the oddball calibers are going to be picked up. For example, on the market right now, there's still tons of 9x18 that is out there and could be had for fairly decent prices. And the reason for that is most people don't have 9x18, so if you're one of the few that do, you still have ammo. Good for you. But the problem with those oddball calibers is that there's no motivation on the side of the ammunition producers to really get them out in any kind of substantial quantities. So yeah, into a situation like we're dealing with now, where there is a shortage, they'll get you further. You'll still be able to find the oddball ammos on the shelves for a while, but they're also not going to be replaced for a very long while. 9mm is the opposite. If there's a shortage of 9mm, manufacturers try to replace it as soon as possible because that's their bread and butter. Alright, so we've talked about the fact that 9mm is usually fairly cheap, obviously not as cheap as rimfire, but fairly cheap. As far as centerfire rounds are concerned, it is usually the cheapest. And then we've also talked about the fact that it is very market stable. You don't have the prolonged shortages with 9mm that you can get with, say, 22 LR and other rounds like that. The next point that I want to talk about is the fact that 9mm has a usually smaller recoil than a lot of other centerfire cartridges, but it's not insubstantial, and that's an important point. It is both low and high, kind of. It is, in terms of recoil for handguns, it usually sits somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. It's not as low power as 380 or 38 Special. It's not as high power as 40 caliber or 45, certainly not as high as 357 or 44 Magnum or something like that. It's usually kind of middle of the roadish. And this is an important thing. If you're wanting to shoot a lot of rounds enjoyably, you don't want the gun to beat you up. I mean, just think about the difference of firing 50 rounds of 44 Magnum in a day and what that's going to do to you, especially as we get older and you start getting arthritis in the fingers and things like that. And believe it or not, you will eventually get old if you're not there already. And firing certain calibers and certain sizes with a certain amount of recoil starts to hurt after a while. I remember watching a video not too long ago put out by Wilson Combat in which Mr. Hackathorn was on there as one of the Gun Guys episodes, and he was talking about the fact that even though he is a 1911 guy and a 45 guy, he finds himself shooting 9mm now pretty often. 9mm often in a 1911 platform. He's not going to abandon that anytime soon. Certainly not. But he finds himself shooting 9mm more often because, well, frankly, he's getting up there in age and he's got some arthritis in the hands and whatnot and some other issues that are going on, and 9mm is just nicer on the body than some of the other kinds of cartridges that he was regularly firing before that. It doesn't mean that he's given up on those cartridges altogether or that he never shoots them. He certainly has them in his collection. He very obviously likes them. I mean, He's doing a show on the Wilson Combat YouTube channel. It's pretty clear that he certainly does not mind 45, and he said as much in that conversation. But when you're going to go out to the range and you want to get a lot of practice in, you want to have a very high volume of practice, something that doesn't beat you up as much is good. But the flip side of it with 9mm is, even though it's not going to be as punishing as a lot of the larger calibers are, one of the things that's nice about it is that the recoil is not insubstantial. And this is one of the advantages for training purposes that would have over 22 or something like that. 22 is cheap to shoot, and it also is very nice on the body in terms of recoil impulse. But the problem is it's a little too nice. 22 LR does not recoil very much at all, and because of that, it doesn't simulate other rounds very well. One of the classic examples is the military's use of 22 when it comes to training for ARs. There are conversion kits that you can get for a lot of ARs. CMMG, for example, makes some pretty good conversion kits for their AR platform of guns. It's basically a bolt and a magazine that you put into the gun that takes what was basically a 5.56 gun and turns it into a little 22 plinker. And there is, some things that you can do with that in terms of training, but one of the worst things about trying to train with 22 is that 22 just does not have the recoil impulse. It's nowhere near the same. So if you train with 22 for something that is substantially more powerful, and the comparison between 22 LR and 5.56 is a really big difference, especially in terms of actual recoil. And what happens is, if you get someone who trains predominantly with 22 on that platform, they'll know how the gun works just fine, know where all the buttons are, those kinds of things. That part of it's awesome. But when it comes time to actually shoot in a real-world scenario, they'll start getting flinchy. And it's because they didn't train for the recoil impulse. And that will catch them off guard. They're going to react to it. And when the adrenaline starts flowing, you can become real flinchy real quick. Even if under range conditions you never would. If there's a big enough difference in the recoil impulse that you practice with versus what you actually use in real-world scenario, it can produce problems. Recoil sensitivity becomes a bit of an issue. And so a lot of militaries and also a lot of government agencies have switched over from using 22 LR as their training caliber to going to 9mm conversions. So you get 9mm ARs, you get 9mm in just about anything. You got 9mm AKs that are out there now. They have a 9mm version of the X95 Tavor, which I have, and it's actually a really good gun. And that was probably one of the smartest things that IAWI has ever did, is put out a basic platform that had three fairly usable calibers. The Tavor series that's out now, the X95, is available in 9mm, it's available in 5.56, and it's also available in 300 blackout. And the idea is that you use the 9mm kit for training purposes, and then you use the 300 blackout and the 5.56 for serious use. And as long as you're doing something that's relatively close range, which would also be the case with 22R training kits, it's going to hit in close enough to the same place that you're going to be able to mimic what you do in real world. But the major difference is that the recoil impulse of the 9mm is much closer to what the recoil impulse of 5.56 or 300 blackout is going to be. So you're actually training with that recoil, and because of that, it doesn't tend to take you off guard in a real world situation where you have to use it. So it's a much better training aid in that regard. So training with a 9mm gun is nicer on you in that it's not as heavy recoiling as some other calibers are, but it's still substantial enough that you're not going to get flinchy when you switch out to those other calibers, unless it's way more powerful, like 44 Magnum or something like that. It is less, but it's still not insubstantial. And because of that, it makes it a really good training gun. And one of the reasons why a lot of militaries are switching to using 9mm platform guns, and a lot of agencies are switching to using 9mm platform guns, especially for training purposes. The fourth point that I wanted to bring up about 9mm is that while it is certainly not the most powerful centerfire cartridge out there, it is also not insufficient. And what I mean by that is that in real-world scenarios, a lot of the things that us gun guys tend to look at a lot sometimes don't matter that much. You know, gun guys really like powerful guns. We like ones that are ballistically efficient, that are ballistically superior. We say, you know, a 45 or a 40 is ballistically superior to a 9mm, which is true. Both 45 and 40 have more kinetic energy at the muzzle, they have a larger mass, etc., etc. There's lots of things that you can say that would make them ballistically superior. But the issue is that when you get out in the real world, sometimes those added ballistic issues don't make that much of a difference. And even say with rifles, most rifle cartridges, even an intermediate rifle cartridge like 223 or 556, is definitely going to be ballistically superior to a 9mm. But in a real world situation, is that added power, is that added ballistic capability really going to translate into a proportional advantage in real-world situations? And the answer is usually not. It turns out that in real-world situations where you would use these things, a lot of times dealing with human targets, human bad guys, turns out human bad guys tend to be on the rather delicate side, and it's actually not overly difficult to take them out with proper shot placement. And because of that, the added power that you would get from a lot of rounds tends to, in a sense, be wasted power. Now, yes, it is going to have typically more of an effect on tissue, etc., etc., but if you're looking at it just from the point of view of whether or not the person who used this particular caliber was successful, well, then the difference between the two tends to be minimized. And what I'm thinking of in particular is the Greg Ellerfritz study that was done a while back. Greg Ellerfritz is someone who's in the gun community, and specifically in the self-defense gun community, that has a pretty good reputation. He's someone who would be fairly similar to Massad Ayoob and people like that, and along the same vein of thinking in a lot of regards. And the study that he did was originally supposed to be a stopping power study. And he wound up finding out that the statistics that could be gathered from real-world situations just didn't really lend themselves to that kind of a study very well. But what he was able to do was figure out overall effectiveness pretty well. And that's not very hard to do from a data set. So he looked at something like 1,800 real-world scenarios that he was able to find documentation for. And one of many questions that he tried to ask, like I said, originally it was supposed to be a stopping power study, and he tried to do some work to that effect, but didn't work out overly well. But one thing that did come out of the data was general effectiveness. That is, you could look at the data and say, okay, here are the number of cases where this caliber was used, 38 special, and 357 over here. So here are the number of cases in which this caliber was used, here, 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 and he looked at a bunch of different calibers. And he also looked at rifles, centerfire rifles. He put them all together in one category, and also shotguns he put all together in one category. And after he categorized them, he then asked, okay, here are the cases in which these guns were used, and how many of those cases were they used successfully? That is, person who's using this gun is trying to, stop someone else from doing something. What percentage of the time were they able to stop someone else from doing something? Well, in the original study, he asked it as what percentage of the time were they not able to stop the person with this caliber of gun, regardless of the number of rounds that were fired, regardless of the time that the person took to go down, etc., etc. Just did it work or not, was one of the statistics that he looked at. And it turns out that when you look at guns from that perspective, they tend to be a lot more similar than you might expect. That doesn't mean that there aren't any lessons. One of the things that came out of that was that the general effectiveness of the so-called mouse calibers, like 22, 25, 32, those ones weren't overly effective, and you would expect that. But basically everything from 380 on up was going to be effective at least 80% of the time. A lot of times more than that, but at least 80% of the time, as long as you had at least something that was a 380 in power or up, it was going to work in your favor. And what is interesting is that the difference between the effectiveness of 9mm, the vast majority of the cases, actually I think all of the cases that he looked at, were just handguns. He wasn't including things like pistol caliber carbines or stuff like that. It was all handgun usage. Looking at those statistics and compare that with things that are substantially more powerful, like shotguns and centerfire rifles, it turns out that the difference in performance was fairly small. 9mm turned out to be effective about 87% of the time, whereas long guns, centerfire long guns, rifles, were effective about 91% of the time. That's only a 4% difference in effectiveness. So is there now between a centerfire rifle like 5.56 or even 30-06 or something like that and 9mm, there is a chasm of difference in ballistic performance. Huge. But it turns out that in most real-world situations, that difference is not the critical difference. I'm not saying that they're not related at all. But what usually had more of an effect was whether or not the shots were accurate, how many rounds you had available to fire, things like that. Like I said, humans are not overly tough targets. And because of that, you don't need an overly tough round. So while 9mm may not be optimal, and it certainly is not going to be the most powerful round out there, 9mm in most cases is sufficient. Now, 9mm does have a limited range. For handguns, it's common for most people not to be effective past 15 yards with almost any handgun, and that would include 9mm. And then if you put it in some kind of a longer form, like a pistol caliber carbine or something like that, for most people functionally about 50 yards. So anything past 50 yards, yeah, look at getting, a serious rifle caliber. But inside of that range, turns out that there's not a whole lot of difference. So given that it's cheaper, given that it's much more market stable, given that it's a good training platform for some of the more serious calibers, starts making it look a little bit better. All right, and then the next thing that I wanted to mention is that 9mm guns are usually much more size and weight efficient than a lot of the other calibers are. Just as an example here, and this was cleared off camera, I have my CZ P10C. And this gun is considered a compact, definitely not a subcompact, but it is considered a compact, and yet the flush-fitting magazines for this thing hold 15 rounds, and I have some base plate extended magazines just because it came with the gun, so I figured, hey, why not? But the base plate extended magazines hold 17 rounds in what is considered a compact gun. Something that I can conceal carry on my person fairly comfortably. Now, I'm not saying that this would be comfortable for everybody. Okay, you're gonna, your body size, your body contours, and those kinds of things better than I do. But for me, this works as something that, as a concealed carry gun, very well. It's not overly heavy, it's not overly bulky, and in terms of size and weight efficiency, I have a whole lot of rounds in a relatively small package. Now, there are other guns out there that can hold just as many or more rounds. For example, there are 45 caliber Glocks out there that you can find 30-round magazines for. Now, the 30-round magazines tend to stick out of the thing quite a bit. You have the gun and then the magazine sticks out like half a foot at least, but they exist. You can get just about any number of rounds that would be remotely practical in just about any gun, as long as you have a big enough magazine. But is it going to be size and weight efficient? That is, would that lend itself to something that would be conducive to concealed carry? Probably not so much. And they do make double stack magazines for 45s and 40s, of course, but they tend to be quite a bit thicker and not nearly as comfortable to grip or to carry on your person, especially if you're talking about inside the waistband kind of things. And then even with the 9mm long guns, if you can call it that, I'm thinking that from now on I'm just going to call the 9mm long guns PC3s, pistol caliber guns with a third point of contact, and that way it covers the carbines, it covers the ones that have the pistol braces, etc., etc. I'm just going to call them PC3s, pistol caliber with a third point of contact. And those kinds of guns are nice. This one is hot because it's the one that's doing self-defense duty right now, but like this CZ Scorpion. And the nice thing about it is that it is not overly big, even though it is a big gun. You know, has kind of the form factor of a rifle, even though technically it isn't one. But it folds up to a relatively small package. This whole thing is only about 17 inches long when it's folded up. And that means that it fits in my 18-inch pistol case quite well. And it makes it very easy to take with me. And that's one of the things that you have to consider for training. You know, is it cheap enough to regularly train with? But also, is it something that I'm going to have with me when I need it? And is it going to be easy to take to the range and not overly cumbersome? I don't have this giant carry case that I have to fit everywhere. Is it something that's small, compact, relatively light? And 9mm guns are usually better at doing that. Now, you can get some small ARs and you can get some small AKs, but they're usually not quite as small. And then when you get those kinds of guns down to that size, you usually lose quite a bit of power. You also sometimes lose reliability. And like I said, in terms of overall effectiveness, 91% with centerfire rifles, 87% with 9mm handguns. The overall effectiveness is not substantially different in real-world situations. So like I said, with pistols, if it's 15 yards or in, not a huge difference. And if you're talking about long guns, as long as it's 50 yards or in, not a whole lot of difference. But you get better size and weight constraints, meaning that for handguns, you're more likely to have it on your person when you need to, because it's not big, bulky, and in the way, and you can fit a ton of rounds in there. And frankly, with this thing, it holds 17 rounds as it's currently configured with the current magazines that I use with it. Holds 17 rounds. I usually don't bother with carrying a backup magazine because the main magazine holds a lot of rounds already. And as long as I'm conserving my ammo during an encounter, you know, fire 2 or 3 rounds, pause, fire 2 or 3 rounds, pause, which is something that you have to train for, but as long as that's what you're doing, you're not going to blow through a ton of ammo. You can afford to only carry 1 magazine if you so choose. I'm not telling you what you should do, but for me, I don't really worry about carrying a second magazine just because the first magazine already holds a lot of rounds and usually way more than is used in a typical self-defense encounter. You can look at, say, John Correa's stuff on YouTube, the Active Self-Protection and the Active Self-Protection Extra YouTube channels, where he talks about real-world encounters that have happened on video camera, a lot of times security camera. And he actually goes through the event from beginning to end. He'll do, you know, an approximate round count and those kinds of things. And the vast majority of the time, the encounter is over in 7 seconds, almost, and in pretty much none of the situations does anybody ever reload. That is really rare unless you're talking about a police situation where there is a duty on the police to pursue the suspect. Normal civilians don't have a duty to pursue, so as soon as the guy runs off, the encounter is over. Those are about the only situations where you'll see reloads. And a lot of times, you know, it's 4 or 5 shots, maybe 7. Maybe you'll go through an entire magazine, but that's usually panic fire, and the assailant is already down, which makes that panic fire subject to some severe legal scrutiny, we'll say. Or the assailant has already ran off and the panic fire is not getting you anything. It just, again, creates more of a liability if you happen to hit something you're not supposed to. So most situations, for the average civilian, it's not bad. The size and weight efficiency of most 9mm guns is worthwhile considering. You do give up power, but you gain the ability to always have something on hand when you need it, something very easy to transport. Like I said, with my CZ Scorpion here, this thing is easy to throw in the car and go, because like I said, it folds up, put it in a nice little case. No real special things that you have to do. Don't have to really move anything out of the way in the car to put it in there, you know, just basically throw it in the back and go. And I don't really feel like I can do that with my full-size AR. I do have a full-size AR, and when I'm talking about wanting to do something past 50 yards, yeah, I bring out my AR, because If you need range, there's nothing that beats a true rifle. But like I said, 50 yards and in, the effectiveness between 9mm and other calibers is usually just not enough to talk about in real-world situations. The Greg Elephant study showed that 87% of the time, 9mm handguns got the job done, whereas centerfire long guns, rifles, got the job done 91% of the time. That's more, but it's only 4% more. Not a huge difference. And like I said, given that 9mm guns are just so much more size and weight efficient, it really does help. And even with smaller cartridges like 380, for example, 380 is a smaller cartridge than 9mm, basically the same diameter, but overall smaller cartridge. But the guns are not usually as size and weight efficient. And that's because a lot of 380 guns are not double stacks. A lot of 9mm guns, though, do have these wonderful double stack magazines. Well, double stack single feed, but double stack magazines. So even though 380 is smaller, you still typically get more rounds in a gun with 9mm, especially for a given size and weight constraint that you're working with. And then after size and weight constraints, the sixth reason to consider adding 9mm to your current collection is that the number of options you have available in the 9mm caliber world is simply greater than for any other caliber. You have more kinds of ammunition available to you, and you also have more kinds of guns that are available to you. Like everybody and their dog makes some kind of 9mm round, and everybody and their dog makes some kind of 9mm gun. So the possibility of finding something that is going to fit you, going to fit your particular needs, be comfortable for you to shoot, etc., etc., is really high with 9mm. Finding something that is going to fit your budget, fit your lifestyle, fit your personal preferences in the 9mm world is really, really super high. Okay, if you're a 1911 guy, guess what? They make 1911s in 9mm. If you're someone who happens to like AKs, they make AKs that are, or at least AK-esque, in 9mm. If you're someone who likes ARs, they make ARs in 9mm. You can get pretty much anything that you want in 9mm. Any kind of preference, any kind of hand size, etc., etc. There's going to be something in the 9mm world for you. It's just a matter of finding it. And like I said, the same thing goes with ammunition. There are tons and tons and tons of different 9mm rounds that are out there. Whether it be, plinking rounds like I've been showing you guys here, my Browning, Winchester. Everybody makes 9mm ammunition, but also what the 9mm rounds can do is pretty substantial as well. One thing that is worth pointing out is that there are 9mm rounds on the market that even out of handguns, usually has to be full-size handguns, but out of handguns are capable of penetrating armor. That's one of the complaints against pistol calibers in general, is that, if you have a serious threat, some kind of serious barrier to deal with, you really need a more powerful gun. And it's not a bad idea to have a more powerful gun. But the interesting thing about 9mm is that it is a small enough diameter that if you just push it a little bit harder with the right kind of projectile, a lot of those same barriers that you otherwise would need to step up to like a 223, 556 type gun for, 9mm can actually get in there and do the same thing. It has to be within a given range. Okay, 9mm is not going to be a long range gun pretty much ever, but within a given range, it can get through a lot of the same barriers that you would need a 556 or a 223 for. And there's lots of 9mm rounds out there that are available to civilians that can do this. There is the Liberty Civil Defense 50 grain load that is capable of defeating soft body armor. There is the Underwood Plus P Plus that is loaded with the Lehigh, I think it's the Extreme Defender, either 90 grain or 65 grain, that can also defeat soft body armor. And then of course infamously there is the 80 grain TUI round from Fort Scott Munitions that can also do the same. And out of full-size handguns, they can defeat soft body armor. And given that we will live in a world where there is a lot of soft body armor that is at least available to people, not that they commonly wear it, but it is at least available to people, it's at least worth considering. Most of the time civilians don't have to deal with soft body armor, but there are certain situations in which they may. For example, armored car drivers and people like that deal with things that are at least supposed to be more secure, or the people who would be attacking them are probably going to step up their game a little bit. They could have to deal with soft body armor, and that could be a very real concern. Well, there are 9mm rounds that can deal with that. The variety of 9mm ammunition and the variety of 9mm guns that are out there, like I said, can fit the vast majority of roles that are out there. Granted, 9mm is never going to be a great 200-yard gun or even a great 100-yard gun. But like I said, 50 yards and in for the average civilian with a PC3, pistol caliber gun with a third point of contact, is very doable. And inside of 15 yards, most civilians, even ones that don't get to train very well, can still use a handgun pretty effectively in that range, as long as they have some training under their belt. Alright, so that's it. Those are the 6 reasons to consider adding 9mm guns to your collection. First, 9mm is relatively cheap, and in terms of centerfire ammunition, it's usually the cheapest. Number 2, 9mm is very market stable. It makes up the largest share of the American market, at least in the contiguous United States, and therefore it is the one that is usually replenished the fastest after some kind of a shortage. Reason number 3, 9mm, in addition to being relatively cheap, relatively market stable, is also unique in its recoil signature. It's relatively weak, so it's not nearly as punishing as some other rounds are, but it is still substantial, which means that you do actually get something from practicing with it. If you practice with 9mm and step up a little bit, you're not going to be as flinchy as if you practice with, say, 22 and then step up. The difference in recoil signatures is not going to be nearly as different, meaning that you're going to be more effective when you go to whatever other caliber you want to go to. Right. Reason number 4 that you should consider adding 9mm to your collection is that 9mm, although it is certainly not the most powerful round out there, and certainly not the most powerful centerfire round out there, it is still sufficient in most cases. Like I said, in the Greg Ellerfrit study, it was effective 87% of the time, whereas even centerfire rifles were effective only 91% of the time. It's only a 4% difference. So, are those other calibers more powerful? Yes. Is that power difference, though, enough to make a difference in real-world scenarios? Not a lot of the times. Handguns, like I said, 15 yards and in, just fine. And for longer guns, PC3s and that kind of thing, as long as it's 50 yards and in, just fine. And most civilians, their shootings and their self-defensive situations are usually well within 50 yards. So it is usually sufficient for the task. Reason number 5 to consider adding a 9mm gun is that they are size and weight efficient. You can usually hold a lot of bullets in a relatively small package, and that is really a good advantage. It just makes it much better for everyday carry. It makes it better for taking it on trips to the range. Just easier and handier to have. And then last but not least, reason number 6, 9mm, the 9mm market is vast. They have tons of different kinds of ammunition, even civilian legal armor piercing ammunition, and the guns are of a huge variety as well. You can find pretty much anything that is going to fit your particular needs. So, those are 6 reasons to consider adding 9mm to your list of guns that you have in your safe. I'm not suggesting that you get rid of your 45s if you're a 45 guy, but being able to trade out to something that's maybe not quite as hard on the body, like Keith Thorne mentioned, maybe not a bad idea, and certainly something that's cheaper to shoot might be not a bad idea. Okay, if you happen to like your 5.56 long guns, that's great, but again, that can be somewhat expensive compared to 9mm. So as long as your training is at relatively short distances, for those days that you do short distance training, using 9mm instead could be really substantial. And like I said, 9mm has a recoil impulse that is at least comparable to a lot of other guns, such that you're not going to deal with too much flinchiness and whatnot, so it works. Okay, lots of good reasons to consider 9mm. Hope that at least got you guys thinking. Like I said, I'm not suggesting that you throw out all of your other guns. I'm not saying that you have to stop being 45 guys or 40 guys or whatever. I'm just saying considering adding it to your collection. There are some good reasons to. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.